We first started getting to know Impetus in 2013 and joined the portfolio in 2014. And I've often rather likened it to a sort of dating relationship where those first few meetings with Impetus were very much sort of getting to know you and exploring whether this was a good fit on both sides. And then gradually over time that relationship deepened to the point of getting to the investment committee, which I sometimes consider sort of like the engagement phase, and then through to a much more longer term relationship. And we're now in our 9th year of the partnership. But excited as we were about the potential funding that Impetus could bring, it was very clear to me early on that there would be so much more to this partnership than just the finances. And it was really important to figure out on both sides, I think, whether that was going to be the right partnership for everybody in terms of our values, our level of ambition, what we wanted to achieve over the long term. And I think what really excited me about the potential to partner with Impetus was that focus on impact and ultimately wanting the best outcomes possible for young people.
Action Tutoring came into the Impetus portfolio 9 years ago. Impetus seeks to support charities that are working with young people facing disadvantage, specifically in education and employment. With education, we're focused on the attainment gap. We know that young people facing disadvantage tend to not reach the same level of academic attainment as their more advantaged peers, especially when it comes to GCSE and SAT results. Action Tutoring's work is square in the middle of that mission, so it was an obvious fit from our perspective that we would want to support them to develop their model, refine their theory of change, prove their impact, and then we're now supporting them to scale that impact. Every organisation in the Impetus portfolio, in addition to the funding that they receive, they also receive a considerable amount of capacity building and also pro bono support through our networks. The capacity building comes in a range of forms, but primarily it's that you have access to an investment director who typically will spend 1 day a week focused entirely on your organisation and on you as the chief executive. So part of my role as an investment director is to work with Susannah with a view of strengthening and growing Action Tutoring and supporting them to achieve for young people. So we typically meet once a month for our monthly meetings. We'll often have contact in between those times as well. We work through whichever issues we feel are most pressing at that point in order to support Action Tutoring as an organisation. It could be across leadership or governance or fundraising or impact or finances. So a really broad range of topics that we will work through. I think the investment director chief exec relationship is really special because it's a confidential space. Impetus tries to bring empathetic challenge and create an environment where the chief executive feels that they've got a safe space in order to really dig into whatever the issues might be that are presenting for them and their organisation. And we seek to provide that kind of thought partnership, that space in order to work through those issues, bring in additional resource where needed, so we can call on other resources within the Impetus network or other members of staff at Impetus who might have particular expertise they can bring to bear to a situation. But the investment director first and foremost creates the space to surface those issues in a safe and confidential way and to try and find solutions to them as best we can. And I think it works really well because we're able to be really frank and honest with each other, give feedback in both directions because we're clear that we're both here for the same reason, which is to get the best for Action Tutoring and the best for young people.
I think the phrase that Bea just used, empathetic challenge, sums it up really well. That there's high trust in the relationship, there's high support, but there is also high challenge ultimately because we're ambitious and we're ambitious about the outcomes that we want to see for the young people that we work with. And I think that shared goal really roots the relationship and the partnership. And I've absolutely loved that it feels a very safe space, whether that's to share challenges. Sometimes it's been a bit of a shoulder to cry on or a safe space to talk about things that perhaps as a leader that it's tricky to talk about with other people, but also a space to be challenged and to think, well, should we be being a bit more ambitious there, or should we be thinking about this a bit differently, or have we put enough resource in this area? And sometimes I've been able to use it as a space to take ideas that I'm just in the very early stages of thinking about and testing. And whilst I primarily hold the relationship with the investment director, I've also really appreciated the way both Bea and previous investment directors have also got to know other senior members of the team and have been able to work with them on some of their particular areas that they lead on, and that it's not just a relationship that sits with me but with the whole organisation, also getting to know our board, attending the board meetings as an observer, and building that sort of depth of understanding across the whole organisation and across the whole team. I think there's that sharing because it's not just about the money. Sometimes I think when charity relationships with a funder are just about the money, there's a danger it becomes a bit of a tick box exercise. You want to make sure you're going to hit whatever was set out in the grant agreement, and you don't want to sort of risk losing that. And I think the relationship with Impetus feels very different because it takes a longer term view. Yes, there are milestones and objectives that we're trying to achieve, and they're a really important part of working on together. But it feels like there's a joint ownership of trying to achieve those, working on it together, understanding together what might be the barriers or the blockers, and thinking about how we can overcome it. So it doesn't feel like just us reporting to the funder, but actually this is something we're owning together and working on together, and Impetus are there to help us to achieve and want us to achieve those goals and those milestones just as much as we want to for ourselves. So for me, it's always been a case of, well, why would I not share honestly what those challenges are? If there's an opportunity to get help and to be honest about it and to flag it early so we can think about those solutions together, why would I not want to bring in that expertise? So I think in terms of impact, I mean, at the kind of absolute heart of it, we're really proud that our results for our pupils facing disadvantage far achieve those national statistics for pupils from lower income backgrounds. And that's ultimately what we want to see, a closing of that attainment gap between free school meal pupils and their wealthier peers. At the moment, our results don't quite meet the national average for all pupils. That's our sort of ultimate goal, to really see a complete closing of that attainment gap on our programmes. But we do get significantly above those national average figures for pupils on free school meals. And that's sort of critically at the heart of it. But in terms of how we've got there, there have been quite a lot of stages along that journey. And one of the very first things we did with Impetus was actually sit down and look at what data do we already have, what do we know, and what more do we need to be tracking. And looking back to 2014, there were some really basic things that we were missing. We didn't always know, for example, how many sessions pupils were attending. We weren't getting great data return submissions from our partner schools about pupils working out grades and actual GCSE and SATs results. And those are the things that we've just absolutely moved miles on. So now we get about 98-99% data return rate from our partner schools, which is fantastic. We can tell you exactly how many sessions pupils attended, who they've worked with, how big their group size was, and so on. And there's so much richness in that data that we can then use for evaluation to really understand what's working, what's not, and what's driving those outcomes for our pupils. But the other side of it has also been about working on our curriculum and what's the content going on during those sessions. And again, we've moved miles on this in terms of the structure of the programme, the resources that we provide for tutors. We work closely with English and maths curriculum experts to develop those. They've gone through a huge range of iterations over the year to make sure that they're really aligned to the curriculum and those areas that those pupils really need to focus on. So it's about both the content of what's going into the programme, but also the data and the quality of that data and what we can learn from it, all of which is gearing towards how do we ultimately make sure that this is closing the attainment gap for those pupils. And actually for me, just last week, I had a significant funder say to me, this level of detail and data just isn't normal from a charity. And I thought actually that really sums up kind of what we've achieved with Impetus, that this funder had been working with charities, charity partners of the year and so on for many, many years. So they're quite familiar with the charitable sector, but they were saying they'd never seen data in detail like we had, and actually reflecting on that conversation with a colleague afterwards, we hadn't kind of had to do lots of homework for that meeting. It's just data that we kind of live and breathe, and we just know it because it's so intuitive to the team. And I think that's true across the team, that people know the key stats, they know what we're collecting, they understand how this works, and that's been a really long-term process to make sure it's not just sort of coming from the top of the organisation, but there's a real culture of understanding why the data matters, why the evidence matters, and ultimately what all of that's gearing towards in terms of impact.
I think what Action Tutoring and Impetus have been able to achieve over the 9 years in terms of impact is extraordinary. I think that impact is really core to the Impetus model. We invest in organisations that we believe have the potential to demonstrate benchmark beating outcomes, so that they're able to demonstrate their delivery to young people beats or exceeds a comparable benchmark in the wider sector. So that was very much a motivating force for us investing in Action Tutoring 9 years ago, because we could see that potential there. And more than seeing the potential in the model itself, it was recognising the culture and the ethos in the organisation was attuned to impact to begin with. So all of the nuts and bolts may not have been in place at that point, but the willingness to get there absolutely was, and that's crucial. Fast forward to now, and we're in the Action Tutoring offices, and I know there's an impact wall upstairs where all the latest stats are there for everybody to see, visitors, members of staff, whoever it might be. They've got all the latest information to their fingertips. Just before this, we were having our monthly meeting, and Susannah's able to show me her live dashboard on the screen of exactly how many young people they've reached so far this academic year as of this morning. We're having really rich conversations about understanding the model. Susannah already alluded to that. There's a number of really interesting evaluations underway at the moment to understand what type of tutoring environment is optimal to deliver the greatest impact for young people. So how many sessions do young people benefit most from? How many young people to a tutor is the optimum ratio? All those different levers that Action Tutoring might be able to pull in order to further refine their model and create even more impact for young people, and also looking at opportunities for external evaluation as well. So it's a really rich conversation that we're able to have about impact, that's rewarding for us and for Action Tutoring, and ultimately makes the difference to young people.
And I think actually I'd add, it's ultimately about a culture of learning and understanding with the data. It's never a case of looking at the data and saying, oh, this is a bit rubbish, this might put the partnership in jeopardy because it doesn't hit the milestone that we intended to, but it's always coming at it through the lens of, well, why might this be off track, or why might it even be exceeding the milestone that we've set? What's working to make sure that it is on track, and what can we do to create the right conditions and environment to get these figures where we want them to be? So very much viewing the data as this is a learning tool rather than a sort of pass-fail tool is a very different approach to how I think some funders view data. I think an example for me of when the Impetus partnership really came into its own was in March 2020, when all the drama of COVID-19 hit. And we found ourselves in an extraordinary position of suddenly, almost overnight, our schools shut and all of the delivery, which at the time was entirely face-to-face, ceased. And there was actually a moment where I really wondered whether Action Tutoring would survive this. Would we get back to face-to-face delivery? Would our finances last that long? And basically, what would all of this mean for the organisation when all we'd known was face-to-face delivery? But it didn't take long for the idea of the National Tutoring Programme to bubble up, and Impetus were part of those early days conversations and rapidly saw that actually as an organisation we could play a really critical role in that, but not just in terms of becoming a delivery partner for the National Tutoring Programme, although we did do that, but also in terms of actually sharing with policymakers our model and our experience of delivering tutoring to pupils facing disadvantage. And as a result of those relationships and the expertise we'd built up with Impetus, we suddenly found ourselves doing things like giving evidence to the government's Education Select Committee about our model, which was a really critical moment for us as an organisation to be asked to actually share at such a sort of a high-profile forum about our work and our model and everything we'd learned around impact through our work with Impetus. but also then to work with the Impetus team on what our level of ambition should be. We could see this sort of suddenly there's all this money going into the national tutoring programme. Should we be looking to double in size, triple, more than that? But then big questions about how on earth are we going to sustain that when the national tutoring programme comes to an end, which currently it's set to in 2024. So decisions that needed making really quickly, a big level of opportunity, but also some really big challenges and questions for the longer term. And having that really sort of strong relationship already with Impetus, that high level of trust, high level of challenge, but also support, was just absolutely invaluable for being able to make some great decisions, but in a fast-paced environment.
So unfortunately, in the wake of the pandemic, we know that the attainment gap for young people has worsened than prior to going into the pandemic, and it was bad enough already. So we know the need is there, and sadly the need has been growing, and that's a clear signal to us and to Action Tutoring that we need to do more. So Action Tutoring and I are working on really understanding what are the core ingredients of the model in order to drive further scale. So understanding within the kind of tutoring model, evaluating different aspects and elements of that so that we're enabled to scale up the operation to meet that level of need that we're seeing. The environment is changing around us. There's a lot of pressure on school budgets. The future of the national tutoring programme is uncertain. That makes for a challenging external context in order to achieve that scale, but we're well aware of that, and we're having really informed and frank conversations about how we push forward from here to reach more young people when they need it most.
As Bea said, the end of the national tutoring programme is certainly a potential big challenge for us. But we were here long before the national tutoring programme came along, and we intend to be here long afterwards. And we've got 4 really key areas that we're working on. One is, and perhaps the most obvious one, growth. We think we're onto something great. We're really proud of the results we're achieving, and therefore there's a logic to want to reach more and more young people. So we would hope in 3 years' time to be reaching at least 10,000 young people facing disadvantage a year across both primary and secondary schools. But alongside that, we're really interested in reach. So this is not just about the raw numbers of growth, but actually where those young people are. And since COVID, we've introduced online delivery as well as continuing with our face-to-face model. And that's enabling us to get to areas that don't always have much access to external interventions and that we would never have been able to work in before. So particularly more rural areas, coastal areas. And that's something that's been gradually growing for us, but we would hope in 3 years' time that 30% of our delivery will be outside of our main hubs. And already we've got programmes happening in places like Hartlepool, Corby, Southport, Rotherham that we would never have been able to access pre-2020. So reach is our second goal. Third, we've still got a really big focus on impact. We're incredibly proud of that impact to date, but we want to make sure that we're pushing to get our results as close to completely closing the attainment gap as we can, alongside continuing to understand what's really working in our model to drive those results and to drive efficiencies. So we've got a number of sort of mini evaluations going on to ask some questions around things like group size, time of the day, the experience of the tutor, and to really understand what it is that makes a difference on our programmes. And then our final pillar of our strategy, our 4th area, is advocacy. And this really links to how much our voice has grown since 2020 and the role that we've been playing, talking to policymakers since the national tutoring programme came along, and recognising that actually what we can bring to the sector and to young people isn't just our delivery on the ground, important and as obvious as that is, but actually how we help politicians, policymakers think more widely about the role that tutoring can play to close that attainment gap for young people facing disadvantage. And that's been really growing, including with some partnerships with other charities such as the Tutor Trust, who are also in the Impetus portfolio, and get further working on that advocacy together. Conversations with people like the chair of the Education Select Committee, the education team in Number 10, the Department for Education, and also the Treasury, really trying to make that case for the difference that tutoring can make to tackle the attainment gap and to make sure that government and policymakers are thinking about a legacy for that beyond the end of the national tutoring programme. I
think one of the defining features of Action Tutoring that I've come to appreciate in the time that I've been working with Susannah and her team is the focus on quality throughout the organisation, from the board all the way through across the staff team, and of course the volunteers as well, who are crucial to achieving the mission. It's very self-evident that a focus on quality and impact and doing the best that Action Tutoring possibly can for young people is felt throughout the organisation, and it's a real pleasure working with them on that basis.
So I will always recommend Impetus to other charities to explore, there's no doubt about that, but I do always say to other charities that it's definitely a partnership to think really seriously about whether it's right for you, and you need to absolutely go into it not just because of the money that it can bring, but because of what you want to achieve and how you think Impetus can help you to achieve that. You need to be absolutely prepared for scrutiny. You need to be willing to be very honest and share your data and have those robust conversations. You need to be willing, I think, particularly in the early days, for everything to be interrogated and be willing to sort of think differently about your approach. But if you're open to that sort of level of scrutiny and transparency, then I would say the rewards are more than worth it, and that what we've been able to achieve together, I think, is far greater than what we could have achieved on our own as an organisation.
I would say to an organisation that's considering joining the Impetus portfolio, similar to what Susannah said, it isn't a model that suits every organisation, and Impetus are well aware of that. So there's a lot of care and attention goes into our processes to make sure that once an organisation comes into the portfolio, it's right for both us and for them. It is quite a time-intensive partnership. It's unusual. It's very different to other kind of funding models in the sector. Recently, I was working with a chief executive who was new to their organisation, who were already in the Impetus portfolio. So I've been helping them to get their head around what is the Impetus partnership, and it's quite a hard one to explain, and it can sound unusual at first. And then as you come to work with Impetus and you see the level of conversation that we're having and the level of honesty and trust and challenge, and that's where the value starts to really play out. It's not a typical funding relationship in the sense of, we might chat 2 or 3 times a year and there's lengthy funding reports. There's none of that whatsoever. But there is an involved partnership with considerable time commitment from both parties. The model has been developed over a number of years, and we know that it's effective when the right organisations come together. Otherwise, we wouldn't invest as much time as we do, and we wouldn't expect our portfolio charities to invest the time that they do either. So we know that you can get there and achieve real impact, but it's not right for every organisation who might not be quite ready for that type of relationship. But if you are, then this is a great way forward.